Welcome to Tactics Talk. Today we are discussing Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Israeli Palestinian conflict, as well as the Russia and Ukraine conflict. Now, you'll notice something about that introduction. It was relatively neutral. That is part of an information or psychological operation. If I wanted to trigger you, I would say things like genocide or the war. So let's dive right on into this. The first thing we're going to discuss is psychological operations that took place during the Korean War. All right, here we have a leaflet that was dropped over the North Korean area or that front. Here it reads, sketch with caption, welcome Chinese officers and men, come over to our side and we're all friends. Part 2, troops of many nations fighting you in Korea offer you a chance to save your life. Follow the rules, leave your unit, throw away your weapons, approach the UN lines in daytime along the main road. Raise your hands above your head. This shows the UN forces that your intentions are friendly. You'll get food, water, warm shelter. Change your fate, save your life, see your family again. So you'll notice something about this leaflet, regardless of like the propaganda that's right on the front of it. The wording is very direct. It's also it has a specific flow to it, and you'll notice that it's written in a very specific manner. So now let's dive into more psychological operations. I'm going to drag this back over, and we're going to be using flashpoint campaigns to kind of simulate this a little bit, really with the morale mechanic. So let's take a look at operations that took place during the Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan wars, or OEF, Operation Enduring Freedom. So you'll notice that these were kind of the operations that took place during that time as well. We have 2001 to 2005, 2006 to 2009, and then 2010, whether they were downplayed major campaigns, less priority, or a major campaign. That's really something we need to talk about. You'll also notice the CAE. C, whether that theme displays credibility, whether the theme illustrates appropriate cultural, social, and political or religious context, and E, the theme's overall effectiveness. So one thing you're going to notice right here at the top, the U.S. intervention, another neutral word, or war on terror, or the war on terror justifies U.S. intervention. So it's not so neutral. You'll notice that this doesn't have any effectiveness at all, and it's really downplayed in 2010. The Taliban or the forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, they don't, like, culturally, they don't want the U.S. there. So to kind of justify our presence doesn't really ring true with them. We're going there, we're like blowing their things up. So now if we think about like coalition brings peace and progress, that's rather effective. We were effective in like running that campaign. We abided by their social cultural guidelines, and it was actually relatively downplayed in 2010, but as you see, it kind of lost its momentum during 2006 and 2007 because we were there for quite a long time. And then, right, there's like a major campaign right here that's relatively ineffective across all spectrums, but pretty much effective. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are enemies of the Afghan people. I think when we talk about culture, we're going to dive more into Afghanistan here in a little bit. And then, right, there was like a major campaign to kind of cease the use of IEDs, or the U.S.'s campaign against IEDs, and that was relatively normal. But as you see, I want to highlight this less of a priority one right here. U.S. forces and technological superiority. Obviously, like there's like a good campaign, it's going to be effective. I mean, if you've seen the conflict, you see the U.S. weapon systems. I don't think that's really going to be like something you need to worry about as the Afghan people. But slowly towards the end, it became less effective, and that just could be like in 2009, the U.S. wasn't using all its capability, or they just didn't really care about those weapon systems in their country anymore. And then as you see, like the Afghan government, or ANSEP, Afghan National Police, were never really super effective, but as time went on, they became less and less effective, and that could be due to corruption, things along those lines. All right, so we're going to close that. There's a few more of these that I want to show you. And then like this one real quick, I should have brought this one up first. It was just showing you like the sources, themes, explanation of propaganda, whether it's ineffective, mixed, or effective, if you wanted to save that image as well. Now let's move on to China a little bit. China's really interesting because you'll notice that they really ramped up their psychological warfare, or psychological psyops, as time went on. See, in 2002, they really ramped up the usage of cognitive domain, command domain, confrontation, and command of the mind. So let's just talk about like understanding the cognitive domain, the area in which feelings, perceptions, understandings, beliefs, values exist, and in the field of decision making through reasoning. I think that's really important to understand because it just shows that like they're really ramping up like it's social media, TikTok, Instagram, Reddit, all the social media areas. It's all information, an all in information domain. So we could think of that as like an other than war, like an OOTW front. I believe that's what that's called. Um, and so that's just one of their areas where they're dominating right now. You can see this like in the propaganda domain with the Israeli Palestinian conflict war. Use really triggering words, whether that's out of like the Middle East or all those information campaigns. I try and keep things neutral around here because when I don't, people get really downvote happy. And then, so let's bring this over here. And this is a bit of doctrine for the PLA psychological warfare objectives. If we bring this over here real quick and make it really big, obviously, they want to degrade the adversary decision making, right? So that's part of the cognitive domain, weaken the adversary's will to fight. And when we talk about Vietnam, we're going to talk about all of this like will to fight as well. Undermine the adversary's support for war, right? We can see this in the Middle East. Think of like towards the end of the Afghanistan war, there wasn't much support there. The U.S. had mostly pulled out. Trump negotiated the Doha Agreement, which removed all the air power from the region, which means we weren't airstriking Taliban targets anymore. That was one of the biggest things a part of the Doha Agreement while there was when the U.S. was pulling out. I'm not going to say retreating because it was a negotiated peace deal that the Taliban didn't abide by. Regardless, I mean, that could be the Paris Accords in Vietnam as well, which is the NBA and Southern Vietnam. Anyway, undermining the adversary's government from within and support deterrence. So obviously deterrence, I really want to talk about deterrence because deterrence is something we've talked about on this channel. It can go with nuclear deterrence. It can go with chemical deterrence. You'll notice that when the U.S. really ramps up its, let's say, chemical weapon supply or nuclear production, Russia, China, the Middle East, they all start campaigns for deterrence. They'll all jump on board and say, hey, we need to minimize deterrence. We need to weaken our nuclear forces. We need to reduce chemical warfare, things along those lines. So that's part of like the psychological warfare. That's like if you think of like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or war. There's always like peace deals, peace. We need deterrence. We need what is it called? A ceasefire. Like realistically, that's like support of deterrence. Hopefully, I'm like determining that correctly. And that's kind of like the PLA's psychological warfare objectives. So now if we move on to kind of like what took place during Vietnam. Vietnam, all right, actually we're touching on Afghanistan one more time. So there is a posture saying that a single no is worth 1,000 yeses. This means that whenever questioned by someone, a yes response will tend to elicit a follow-up question, while a no response might end the questioning. After decades of brutal Soviet occupation, right there, not a neutral word, civil war, and the repressive rule of the Taliban, most Afghanistans are understandably wary when approached and asked if you want to answer a few questions. We must acknowledge this limitation. And I think that's important, right? If you say yes to a million things, yes, but the second you say no, that ends the questioning. You don't want to be a part of it. So a single no is worth 1,000 yeses. I think we need to think about that when we conduct psychological operations. And we'll dive more into Flashpoint, how it's simulated in here as well if you're here for that gameplay. So moving on, let's touch on Vietnam. Vietnam's really, really interesting. I'll link all these sources down below. All these documents are like 400 pages long, or at least 1,000 words I was looking through. All right, the real worth of a PSYOP against an enemy soldiers lies in the background of progressive erosion of their will and morale. So think about war games. It's always about deteriorating will and morale. This takes place over a period of time during which hardship, sickness, and attacks depress morale. Psychological operations serve as the crystallized dissatisfaction in various soldiers at various times. Sometimes circumstances are such that Ho-Chan results. Most of the time, the results are diminished efficiencies at work or in the attack. This cannot be measured in an easy way to handle numbers. So right here, I don't know if this is a derogatory term. I apologize if it is, but a Ho-Chan was someone who defected to like the U.S. side, so it may be a derogatory. So someone from the NBA, PLA, who was fell for the psychological operation or did want to surrender their weapons and come to the U.S. side, or at least get food and water. So that's something you need to be aware of, and it's something that takes place over a long time. Think of Fallujah, like all the leaflets we dropped, the psychological operation done like that, whether it's providing food, shelter, a warm place to sleep. When it comes down to psychological operations, it's more than just like food and shelter. It's like ensuring that the population can survive. Let's say something like the U.S. forces move into a country. Suddenly, they they drive up inflation because right, the dollar is worth a lot, so housing becomes an issue. Food prices skyrocket. And so over time, the U.S. presence not only like creates inflation, but it also kind of deteriorates the morale of the enemy occupiers or even the civilians that live there. All right, so let's talk some U.S. doctrine in Vietnam. All right, that word's kind of, I can't, this is a scanned PDF, are directed at hostile military or paramilitary forces to reduce their combat effectiveness and at civilians to prevent interference with the tactical operation, reduces non-combatant casualties, and elicits support for friendly forces. Tactical psyops support the tactical plan and are based on achieving short-range objectives. With regard to the evaluation of a psyop effectiveness, the PSYOP doctrine is as follows. PSYOPs are continually evaluated for errors, weakness, or change in which requires an adjustment or improvement. PSYOPs effectiveness is difficult to measure, which we've talked about several times, especially among hostile audience. The quantity of the propaganda output is measured of a PSYOP effort rather than its effectiveness. So let's think about that a little bit. We're not talking about how effective everything is because we don't know how effective it is at the meantime. And if we think about more of this doctrinal approach right here, we're trying to reduce civilian casualties. We're also trying to reduce support for the enemy occupiers or the Taliban or the PLA or the NBA or the Palestinians or Hamas, whoever you want, whoever you're trying to degrade. That's generally your target. You're not worried about how effective it is. You're more worried about the amount of effort you're putting into it, right? So if we bring this image back up one more time, we can take a look at that. It's measured by how effective it is, not how effective, like the effort it is. And so right here we have its major campaign, so we have a lot of effort put forward. And then as 10, 20 years go by, we can go back and kind of determine, is it effective? What are the weaknesses? And so on and so forth. I hope I explained that a little bit. And there's just major campaigns. Let's think about 2001 to 2009. Our big thing was to get Afghanistan government up and running, the ANSEF to bring peace and prosperity, and then the benefits of democracy, right? And so these last two are major campaigns, and there were continued major campaigns all the way through 2010. But at the end of the day, corruption is something that's hard for the U.S. to fight. If the political appointees don't want to really participate, or the U.S. or the people want to take advantage of the current change in the situation, that's something that's going to happen, and that's something that kind of is hard to focus on within the military, or at least in a PSYOP operation. And corruption happens at all levels. A lot of people kind of focus at the top, but let's think about corruption on a small scale. What are corruption on small scale opportunities? Think about a clinic open in a rural village in Afghanistan or Iraq. Corruption could be like that midwife stealing medicine and reselling it, and the U.S. resupplying that medicine. There's corruption at all levels. So as the U.S. comes in and they establish these forces, or the occupier, let's just say occupier, comes into this nation, establishes forces, and doesn't control that corruption, then obviously over time, over a period of 5 years, 10 years, initially there's a big boost, but slowly those parasites work their way in, or they were always there. And then corruption kind of starts to fester, and then you have this collapse in the government, such as we saw in the fall of Afghanistan, or the fall of the Vietnam. Remember, I think the big thing about Vietnam, it was the U.S.'s war on communism, and not so much the U.S.'s war on democracy, or trying to establish good people who made sense. So they always had powerful people who were corrupt in certain areas, and it just didn't jive with the population at the time. So let's talk war games real quick. So how is all this simulated within war games? So some war games do have a psychological operation effort and not so much effectiveness, things like Headquarters World War II, but typically it's depicted as morale, right? And over time, morale does get degraded, and morale can be degraded over time. Obviously, you can start with low morale, you can start with high morale. You can kind of adjust what the enemy's morale is. You can give them less weapons, more weapons. We can take all the night vision systems off these tanks. And part of our campaign is stating that there's no night vision, it's a night operation. And so that kind of like rolls into the US's like technological superiority or even corruption. So we think of like corruption when designing war games. We think of superiority when designing war games. So we need to tie all of that in. And so typically morale within war games is basically their leaders lost. So if we find our headquarters unit right here, if we lose this leader or this main rallying unit, then our morale drops substantially. So if we think of like morale in Flashpoint, if a unit sees another unit destroyed or sees a unit killed, that can affect the morale both positively and negatively. If one of your Panzer Grenadiers right here is taking fire, they're going to be blown up. Their morale is going to drop. The unit next to them is going to see those units dying, either via artillery, tank rounds, ATGMs, and their morale is going to drop as well. Versus when you have your Leopard 1s, your Leo 1s engaging and destroying T-72s, T-80s, you can see the morale for your platoon slowly start to climb. And so it's all psychological. It's also part of a shaping operation to reduce casualties, to kind of, it's just a long, drawn out effort. Whereas in Flashpoint campaigns, it's relatively quick and you kind of design a scenario around it. But if we think of like how that is in war games, it's typically combat related. Whereas like the strategic level or the operational level, your psychological operations are a bit smaller. If we think of like they take place more of in a 4X game where you do long, thorough psyop operations, or you have like a spy intervene and conduct an operation and kind of dismantle or gather intelligence. Those are kind of psychological operations. So all in all, support the channel. These videos take a while to research. Please join. And thank you. Peace out, guys.